There is one food in particular that I simply will not eat again, period. And that's because I know how it impacts my gut barrier specifically. Now, with this, I have to note that a lot of the literature that I'm going to talk about is more in vitro, meaning it's done in petri dishes, it's not in humans. But there are certain things that I look at and I say, is the reward actually there? When I look at the risk reward, is it even worth it to consume it? And the answer for me is no. And I'm not trying to fearmonger. If you want to consume it, you can. I'm talking about pudding. Sounds really bizarre. Some instant puddings, but a lot of pudding cups. Now, let me explain something really quick. When you look at the gut, there are two things that you pay attention to. There's the microbiome, but then there's the gut barrier. The microbiome to me is like vast, and we hardly have any idea what's going on there. We know a few things. The gut barrier, that's more cellular. Those are single cells in the epithelial layer, easier to understand. It's easier to understand how we can affect single cells than it is to try to see how we can affect this vast microbiome. So when I look at literature on the microbiome and how things impact the microbiome, I take it with a grain of salt because I know that there's things in question and things change and everybody's microbiome is different. But when I look at the gut barrier, I'm like, something is potentially damaging the actual cells. I'm going to cut that out first. Let's go ahead and break this down. After today's video, if you are concerned with gut health, I put a link to one of our sponsors, which is Seed. They are a daily symbiotic, which means they have a probiotic and a prebiotic. If you're just looking generally for something that's good to take as far as gut health is concerned, it's probably going to be your best bet. You know, they have been a sponsor on this channel for a number of years now. I've used them for a number of years. I highly recommend it. They have a cool technology with a capsule inside of a capsule. So you basically are getting sort of a proper staging of the delivery of the prebiotics and the probiotics. Again, probiotics aren't for everybody, and I don't really recommend probiotics unless there's something that's been vetted, and Seed really puts their money where their mouth is with their research. They actually fund some of their own clinicals, which is really great. So that link is down below. That saves you 25% off daily symbiotic. And again, full disclaimer, they are a sponsor. You can skip through this part. Absolutely don't have to use them. You can just absorb this content, but sponsors are how this channel stays afloat. And your support always helps this channel as well as gets you something that's good for you. So that link is down below. So there's a study that was published in Molecular Nutrition and Food Research, and this was really interesting because even though it was an in vitro study, they were looking at Polysorbate 80, which is an emulsifier that's in things like pudding cups and a lot of instant puddings too. And they compared it to lecithin. Now, funny enough, lecithin is something that is often like made fun of too. Like people will say, oh, I don't want lecithins. Lecithins are bad as well. Soy lecithin, sunflower lecithin, yada, yada. The reality is lecithin seemed to have practically no impact on gut barrier function, whereas Polysorbate 80 had a tremendous impact. Outside of the fact that Polysorbate 80 literally had cytotoxic effects, like it actually was toxic to the cell, outside of that, and at levels lower than what would cause cytotoxic effects, there were quite significant issues that it caused with the single cells in the epithelial layer. Essentially, a single dose compromised the integrity of the single cells in the epithelial layer, so it compromised the gut integrity. But in addition to that, it reduced the expression of the proteins that would form to actually form tight junctions and keep the gut secure. So in essence, we have something that seems to affect the gut barrier function and then also seems to affect the potential repair. And when you compare it to lecithin, lecithin had no impact. So soy lecithin, sunflower lecithin didn't do anything, whereas Polysorbate 80 did. So it's funny because people want to rain on the lecithins when in reality, as an emulsifier, those are probably a lot safer. In fact, I would go on record and say they are safer. But we're not just talking about Polysorbate 80. There's also another one called Polysorbate 20. There was a study published in European Allergy and Clinical Immunology, and they actually used single cells. They used basically in vitro models to create 3D organelles. So they were able to almost create these 3D models so they could get a bigger, broader idea of how something would impact. It's kind of this newer evolution of in vitro stuff because how something affects a single cell in a petri dish in a lot of ways is nothing like what's going to happen in the real world. However, you got to start somewhere. You got to start there, then you go to an animal model, then maybe a human model. Sometimes human model's not even possible, but the reality is you start there. But now we're able to kind of maybe make these actual 3D organelles, which is interesting. They found that just a single dose of polysorbate 80 and polysorbate 20 caused the single cells to burst. So it actually caused the cells in the epithelial layer to flat out burst. Mechanistically, it seems to have something to do with an inflammatory response. So much concentrated inflammation in the gut at these cells that it seems to cause them to burst. I am somewhat speculating here because this is mechanistic stuff and it's dense, and when we look at in vitro stuff, we have to take it with a grain of salt. Like when we have consumed something, how does the hydrochloric acid in our gut potentially denature these polysorbates? Like how does that impact us, right? We have to look at that. So the way I look at this is like this. You have some people that say aspartame, known carcinogen, right? I'm not going to consume it because it's carcinogenic. Splenda might affect the gut microbiome, so I'm not going to consume it. I'm not afraid of those things. I try to limit them or avoid them. I really don't consume them much, but I will occasionally ingest some, and I'm not freaking out about it. But I try to opt for like stevia, monk fruit, allulose as much as I can. Okay, but those things namely are going to impact the gut microbiome, if at all, which is problematic. It's not good, right? But when I look at something like polysorbate 80 or 20, that's going to impact the cells. Let me explain how this works. So if you have mainly gram-negative bacteria in your gut that are problematic, these gram-negative bacteria produce what are called lipopolysaccharides. These lipopolysaccharides can then cross through the gut junctions if our gut junctions are weak. When they cross through the gut junctions, they go into the bloodstream and clear as day increase inflammation. Lipopolysaccharides do increase inflammation. There is no real denying that. Okay, so on one hand, the microbiome side says, well, if we have less gram-negative bacteria, we'll produce less lipopolysaccharides. On the other hand, you say, okay, well, if I have a strong gut barrier junction and I have a temporary influx of gram-negative bacteria, maybe I can protect them from actually leaking those lipopolysaccharides through my weak junctions into the bloodstream, right? Somewhat speculative because there is evidence that the gut bacteria can actually affect your gut barrier junctions as well. So that certainly is the thing. But I want to prioritize the integrity of my cells, my epithelial layer, as much as I can first. So I know this sounds crazy, but it's just like, this is probably the one thing that just doesn't have a place in my diet. Actually, I take that back. There's two things. The polysorbates, no go. But then there's the margarine and the trans fats, which seem to have an impact on gut integrity as well, which is probably why they have such an impact on inflammation as well. There's a study I talked about in another video. People that consume the most trans fats versus the least trans fats have a 73% higher level of C-reactive protein, inflammation in their body. I'm going to save that one for another day. But at the end of the day, I just don't think it's worth it. I'll see you tomorrow.